It's great to be with all of you again. It's been a little bit more than a year that I've had the privilege of talking to my hometown Civil War Roundtable. I appreciate Rob inviting me to come speak to you and the gracious introduction by Martha. I'm going to be talking today about the second half of my second book in the Meade and Lee series. This is a series of books that I've written to tell the story of the Civil War in Virginia from the retreat of the Army of Northern Virginia across the Potomac following the Battle of Gettysburg through the end of 1863. Most history books skip over that time period. They don't have much to say about it because it produced no great big battle, although it produced a lot of maneuvering and a lot of fighting. There were significant casualties during these 6 months of the war following the Battle of Gettysburg. But historians like to travel in the wake of the big bloodbaths. So the big bloodbaths were taking place in Georgia and Tennessee during this period. So it's sort of like history fast forwards over this part of the war. We get Lee across the Potomac after his defeat at Gettysburg, and the next thing you know, Grant is advancing to start the Battle of the Wilderness, as though for 6 months the two most important armies of the war between the states don't do anything. They went into hibernation and nothing of importance happened. Well, in fact, a great deal of importance happened in Virginia during that period. What happened there is the bridge between the Gettysburg Campaign and the Overland Campaign. There were a lot of very important strategic decisions that were made, a lot of maneuvering, a lot of fighting, and one of the major campaigns during this period is the one that I'm going to talk about tonight, and that is the Bristoe Station Campaign that takes place in October, early October to mid-October of 1863. So to put this very quickly in context, at the end of the Gettysburg Campaign, which actually doesn't conclude until the final days of July of 1863, there had been an attempt by Meade to trap Lee in the Shenandoah Valley after he retreated into the Potomac, and for 10 days there was a real cat and mouse game between Lee and Meade with the Blue Ridge Mountains and a flooded Shenandoah River separating them. Meade missed a chance to trap the Confederates. Lee managed to get back into central Virginia and fight the Battle of Wapping Heights on the way to make that possible. So by the time that you get to July 25th of 1863, this is where the armies are in Virginia. So that's Culpeper Courthouse. It's going to figure very prominently in our story. Culpeper is about 50 miles from Richmond and about 50 miles from Washington. So it is very much in the center of the war in the second half of 1863 and most of 1862, the second half of 1862 as well. So right up there, that's the upper Rappahannock River, and down here, that's the Rapidan River. The red circles are the Army of Northern Virginia. The blue squares, obviously, are the Federal Army under George Gordon Meade. And by the time the armies get back here, following the Gettysburg Campaign, both of them, of course, have been mauled at Gettysburg. They're exhausted, they're worn out, and they have returned almost exactly to the same spot they were in when the Gettysburg Campaign commenced. So all of the maneuvering, all of the fighting that leads you into Pennsylvania and back have just returned the armies to the status quo that existed before Lee's invasion of the North. For the Federals, this poses, of course, a problem. And the question is, what are we going to do after Gettysburg? Lincoln obviously was very disappointed that Lee's army had not been destroyed on the north bank of the Potomac. He's disappointed again that it's not trapped and destroyed in the Shenandoah River. Now that Lee is behind the upper Rappahannock, the Federals have to decide what to do. And of course, the three key players here are President Abraham Lincoln, Henry W. Halleck, who's the General-in-Chief of the Union Land Forces, and Major General George Gordon Meade, who's the commander of the Army of the Potomac. And remember, he takes command of the Army of the Potomac just 3 days before the collision at Gettysburg. So by the time that we get to July 25th, he hasn't quite been in charge of the Army for an entire month. And he is going to remain in command of the Army of the Potomac now throughout the rest of the war, although that is going to be called into question several times in the second half of 1863. Lincoln, Halleck, disappointed with Meade. Remember, there had been the big set-to when Halleck had expressed Lincoln's dissatisfaction at Lee's escape, and Meade had been offended by that and demanded to be replaced as commander of the Army of the Potomac, and Lincoln had to back down and change the word dissatisfaction to disappointment. And this sort of begins to color their relationship. And although Lincoln and Halleck and Secretary of War Stanton are going to forgive Meade for failing to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia above the Potomac, they're never going to forget that he failed to do it. And that's very much going to color their perceptions of Meade through the rest of the war, at least until Grant arrives to really take charge of things in Virginia. The basic problem for the Federals here is, what is the line of advance that they're going to use against the Confederates now? And Meade wants to take the army to Fredericksburg to do what Burnside had attempted to do, make a quick march to Fredericksburg, cross the river before the Confederates could interfere. And the reason he wants to go to Fredericksburg is, from Fredericksburg, his line of supply goes over only 15 miles of railroad back to Acaia Landing on the Potomac River. So most of his supplies would be waterborne. He's only got 15 miles of railroad track to protect. That leaves his combat strength as large as it could possibly be. He's on the direct route to Richmond, and Richmond, of course, is a target that the Confederates must defend. So he can possibly force them into battle on terrain that will be advantage to the Federals. Lincoln, Stanton, Halleck want nothing to do with sending the Army of the Potomac back to the scene of its worst disaster. And they argue that no matter where Meade goes, he's going to find the Confederates waiting for him. They're going to be in a strong position. They're going to be ready to fight. And that it will be no easier to fight the Confederates around Fredericksburg than it would be to fight them around Culpeper Courthouse, where they already were. Meade's argument against Culpeper Courthouse, though, is a pretty good one. And it stems from the fact that his supply line is the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, which runs from Alexandria on the Potomac all the way down to Gordonsville in Orange County. So it goes off this map. Gordonsville, of course, is the railroad link that takes the supplies from the Shenandoah Valley and sends them to the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, which then takes them to the Confederate capital. So it's a vital supply line. But if you are a Federal Army and you're going to advance south using the Orange and Alexandria Railroad as your supply line, you've got a couple of problems. First is a single-track railroad. Can it hold up to the traffic that Meade's going to require? Turns out the answer to that is yes. The Yankee railroads are very, very good. That's not really going to be the problem. The problem is twofold. All of that railroad runs through Confederate territory. It runs through Mosby's Confederacy. And so that whole railroad has to be guarded. Every single inch of it, every culvert, every bridge, every river and creek crossing has to be guarded. And Meade right now is spending 5,000 troops to guard that railroad, the 25 miles of railroad between the Rappahannock River and the Potomac. 5,000 troops. If he begins to advance south, his supply line obviously gets longer. As it gets longer, he has to spool more troops out to defend it. So he's spending more and more men to guard the railroad, which means he has fewer and fewer men up on the front lines to fight the next battle, a battle in which he's sure the Confederates are going to be dug in up to their eyeballs, and he's going to need a massive numerical advantage if he wants to win. The other problem with the Orange and Alexandria Railroad is it runs southwest from the Potomac. In other words, it points away from Richmond. It points away from any important point that the Confederates must defend for a distance of some 60 miles before you get to Gordonsville on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. And what does that mean? It means the Confederates, if pressed, can simply keep backing up. Back up, make Meade lengthen his supply line, spend more troops to guard it, and Lee backs up until he gets to a position that is favorable to him. He digs in. The Yankees have to attack him, and even if they win, they're probably going to take so many casualties and be so debilitated from a victory that it will have done them no meaningful good. Meade is a big believer in, if I'm going to suffer big casualties, and he's aware that every battle that gets fought is bloodier than the battles that had preceded it, he wants those casualties to mean something. Meade is very well aware that the North is having a serious manpower problem. We think of the Confederates as facing a manpower problem, but in the second half of 1863, the North has that problem. Most of the two-year regiments had not reenlisted. They had got home. The North has instituted the draft. The draft at this point is a failure. Meade has had to send 10,000 troops north to help enforce the draft after the New York draft riots. Those are some of his best men who are going to be gone for a while, and that weakens him even more vis-a-vis the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. And in terms of the men that the draft is bringing in, Meade considers them to be all but worthless. You're getting the first of the bounty jumpers, you're getting substitutes, conscriptees, many of them desert before they even get to the army. And Meade says, even the guys who get here are mouths to feed, but they probably don't have what is necessary to fight and win on the battlefield. And so if I'm going to suffer massive losses in the next battle, those losses have to buy something meaningful. And just pushing the Confederates back a little closer to Richmond into yet another heavily fortified position is not the kind of thing that Meade thinks is worth the lives of those precious soldiers. So he's not sensitive of blood. He wants the blood he's going to spill to count for something. And thus far, every battle that you have fought in Virginia has essentially accomplished one thing, and that's to maintain or reestablish the stalemate that has more or less existed there since the very first days of the war. You're no closer to Richmond now, really, than you were when the Battle of Bull Run was fought. And that's after a Chancellorsville, and after Fredericksburg, and a second Manassas, and then Antietam, and a Gettysburg. What has all of that accomplished? And the answer is, it hasn't accomplished very much. You can say negatively, it's kept the Confederates out of the North, and it's allowed Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, but in terms of offensive warfare, it's going to bring the South to its knees. Nothing has been accomplished except a massive expenditure of blood in Virginia. And so Meade doesn't want to go this route. And another reason is because he would have to cross the upper Rappahannock and then the Rapidan if he's going to go down this way. This seems to give all of the advantages to Robert E. Lee. And Meade is reluctant to do that. At first, it doesn't matter a lot because at the beginning of August of 1863, the Union Army is told to pull up on the upper Rappahannock River, which is the northern and eastern boundary of Culpeper County. Culpeper, if you've ever been there, it's a very beautiful part of Virginia. Nice rolling hills and some, kind of little mountains and stuff that pop up randomly across the countryside. Occasional forests, lots of little creeks and stuff like that. But the beauty belies the fact that Culpeper is militarily dangerous ground, and especially for a Union army that is advancing south. If you're a Confederate army and you're in Culpeper, Culpeper is basically a sideways V. Well, there's the Rapidan, which more or less runs east-west, and there's the upper Rappahannock, which runs from the northwest down to the southeast, where it merges, or the Rapidan merges into the Rappahannock here at the southeastern apex of Culpeper, and then, of course, it goes on down to Fredericksburg and from there into the Chesapeake Bay. If you're a Confederate army up here, the maw of that V opens toward the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Shenandoah Valley. That's why in both of Lee's invasions, he passes through Culpeper on his way to the Shenandoah to cross the Potomac River. Okay? But for the Confederates to defend Culpeper, you've got some serious problems. And Lee looks around here when he gets back at the end of July of 1863, and he says, there's no field in Culpeper for a battle because there's no place in Culpeper where you could anchor both flanks of your army. You might find an anchor for the left or the right, but not the left and the right at the same time. And so any position you take in Culpeper is dangerous because your flank could be turned. And if you are defeated in Culpeper, if you follow the line of the Orange and Alexandria from Rappahannock Station down to Culpeper and from Culpeper down to Rapidan Station where it crosses the Rapidan River, that's only 23 miles. And of course, the closer you get to the apex of the V, the more narrow it becomes. You lose a battle, and you are very quickly going to have to retreat across a river. And although there are lots of fords on these rivers, there's only bridges, really, at where the railroads cross. And those fords, of course, can disappear after one good, hard rain. And therefore, you not only have to get your army across the river, even in good weather, that means fords, that means bottlenecks that slow you down, that give the enemy a chance to catch up to you. But if it rains, those fords aren't there at all. And your back is against a river, and you're liable to destruction. So Lee decides, I'm not going to stay here. I'm going to pull my infantry below the Rapidan and leave my cavalry in Culpeper as a buffer to keep an eye on Meade and to keep him distant while we recover from the Gettysburg Campaign. For the Federals, to advance into Culpeper County is equally dangerous because Once they're in there, they are susceptible to having their flank turned. It would be very easy for Lee to cross the Rapidan, come up around their flank and either strike down on them, forcing them into the apex of that V, or forcing them to retreat across the Rappahannock, or he might even strike more deeply and try and get between them and Washington. And there's no real good way to keep the Confederates from doing any of those things if you are inside Culpeper County. There's a little bit of oddness about Culpeper. It's really kind of in a bowl. So the ground on the south bank of the Rappahannock is higher than the ground inside Culpeper, and the ground on the north bank of the Rappahannock is higher than inside Culpeper. And what does that mean? If you're the Confederates, that means that, and you're in Culpeper County, the Federals could mass behind that high ground and then make a sudden move on you, and you would find out about it too late. If you're the Confederates, the Federals are in Culpeper, the Confederates could mass behind that high ground and make a move before you realized what was going on. And so neither army really wants to be in Culpeper County for very solid military reasons. So Meade is brought to a halt by Lincoln's order on August 1st of 1863, told to dispatch these 10,000 men to enforce the draft in the North. And for the next 6 weeks, the armies are going to kind of sit there, and they're going to recover from Gettysburg. And they recover from Gettysburg very quickly. By the beginning of September, Lee has 72,000 men, and Meade has 88,000 men. So you're almost at exactly the numbers they had at the start of the Gettysburg Campaign. So there's a sort of idea in the historiography that if the Confederate Army doesn't recover from Gettysburg, it does recover from Gettysburg. And the Federals recover from Gettysburg at equal speed, but they don't grow a whole lot larger than that until Grant shows up and starts to pull in troops from the Washington defenses and these sorts of things. So just like every other big battle, Gettysburg's a big bloodletting. It's very dramatic, but it doesn't change anything. The war goes right back to this status that it's had ever since 1861. So the Federals and the Confederates are sitting there all through August and into September. And of course, what's happening out west in September is that the Federals are moving on Knoxville and they're moving on Chattanooga. And word of these Federal advances comes into Richmond rather slowly, kind of cloudy what's happening there. But something's up. Something's dangerous. Chattanooga, Knoxville are under threat. How are we going to save them? So in late August, early September, Lee and Davis have a meeting in Richmond, and Davis basically says, how do we save Chattanooga? And it's the same thing that had been discussed in May when it was, how do we save Vicksburg? And the two options were the same. We take troops from Lee's army and we send them to the threatened point, or Lee goes over to the offensive and tries to wreck the Army of the Potomac and threaten Washington and force the Federals to pull troops from the west to defend their capital. And just as they had done in May, Davis and Lee agree that he's going to go on the offensive. And so Lee starts to get ready for an offensive, but before he can launch it, Chattanooga and Knoxville fall. And so they have to instead take two divisions from Longstreet's corps and send them on that long 700-mile route to reinforce Bragg, that is going to give you ultimately the Battle of Chickamauga. This reduces Lee's strength to 55,000 men. And when the Federals begin to pick up rumors of this, before the Battle of Chattanooga is actually fought, there's a question as to, have those Confederates really left? Where have they gone? And if they have left and Lee is weak, is there opportunity here to do something? But you got to answer the question first. Has Longstreet really left? So on September 13th of 1863, acting on Stanton and Halleck's orders to find out what's going on in Virginia, Meade sends his entire cavalry corps under Alfred Pleasonton into Culpeper County. And this produces the Battle of Culpeper Courthouse, really fascinating cavalry engagement, spans 2 days, and it forces Stuart back behind the Rapidan River, where Lee's infantry is waiting. The Federal cavalry goes to the Rapidan, finds out that the Rapidan fords are well manned and well defended. Pleasonton is able to tell Meade, and thus Meade is able to tell Washington, Longstreet's gone. We don't know where he went or what he's doing, but he's not behind the Rapidan. And so the question after that is, what should Meade do? And Meade is sending this question to Washington, and Halleck does not answer him very quickly. Halleck's beginning to get distracted about what's going on in Georgia and Tennessee, and so Meade is kind of out there dangling. What do I do? And Meade decides that what he's going to do is he's going to move his infantry to Culpeper Courthouse. He's going to make a small advance and see if that advance scares Lee into retreating toward Richmond. Because if Lee is down a corps now, he might not want to stay this far away from the capital. He might want to back. So if I make this advance, I might scare Lee farther south, and I'll get to jump the Rapidan River without a fight. Robert E. Lee, of course, doesn't scare. He's dug in behind the Rapidan. He has no intention of retreating. And so Meade has to figure out what he does. He's in the Culpeper V now. He doesn't want to be there. He knows how bad a spot that is. And the only thing that can justify staying there is the use of the spring forward for offensive action. And the only kind of offensive action that's possible is to try and outflank Lee to the east or the west, because a direct frontal attack on those fortified fords is suicide. The Federals, of course, have operated to the east before in the Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville campaign. They sort of know what's out there. They haven't operated to the west in Madison County. So John Buford and James Kilpatrick's cavalry divisions are sent out west to check out Madison County, produces the Battle of Jack's Shop. The Federals find out what they want to know, that the road net here is good. We could go this way if we want. But before Meade can act on it, the Battle of Chickamauga is fought. And the Federals are beaten, and they're chased back into Chattanooga. And when word of that hits Washington, D.C., of course, it produces a great deal of consternation. There's anger that Meade had sat and let Lee send Longstreet west. Of course, this is not Meade's fault, because Washington told him to stay on the upper Rappahannock River. It never told him, okay, now you can resume offensive operations. So he's just been obeying orders. So this is more Washington than it is Meade. Nonetheless, Lee has pulled a fast one on him. Lee and Davis have pulled a fast one on him. So now what do we do? And so there's a conference in Washington. Halleck, Stanton, Secretary of Chase, Lincoln, Joe Hooker, they all get together with the head of the Federal Railroads, and Stanton says, we need to do what the Confederates did. We need to take a bunch of troops from the Army of the Potomac, which isn't going to go fight anybody anyway. Meade has more men than he needs to defend Washington, but send them out west, where within 5 days they can be on the scene and save Rosecrans' army, which is trapped in Chattanooga. Lincoln and Halleck, however, say, well, not so fast. If Longstreet's really gone, and it seems pretty certain he is, then there's a chance here in Virginia. The odds are suddenly in our favor. We could accomplish something decisive in Virginia if Meade will go onto the offensive. And the question therefore goes to Meade, are you prepared to launch an offensive? Well, Meade's just digesting the information from Buford and Kilpatrick's reconnaissance, and he sends word back to Washington, well, I haven't got any definitive plans yet. And for Lincoln and Halleck, that's it. No definitive plans. We have no faith in you doing anything. And so the orders go out, and the 11th and the 12th Corps are plucked from the Army of the Potomac and sent out west. And Meade actually handled this very expeditiously. Within 24 hours, these troops are on the railroads and heading to the capital. It's done very, very efficiently. Lincoln had quipped, if we gave the order tonight, the troops couldn't be got to Washington in 5 days, let alone gotten to Tennessee in 5 days. And Meade sort of proved him wrong about that. But now Meade has lost 2 entire corps. How many men is that? It's 13,000 men. These are small corps, 13,000 men. And their departure actually changes nothing in the odds ratios here, because just as these men leave, the 10,000 troops who had been sent north to enforce the draft come back. So Lee's still down to 55,000 because he sent troops west. Meade's still sitting at 88. He hasn't lost any strength at all. But psychologically, he's lost more than he could afford to lose. He had 7 corps, now he's down to 5, and he tells his wife, I've been put on the defensive. I can't do anything now. So that's how Meade is going to read this. That is not how Robert E. Lee is going to read it. No, Robert E. Lee says 2 Union corps are gone. And they still outnumber me, but I don't care. I've been wanting to go over to the offensive since August, and here is my chance. So At dusk on August 4th, here's your situation. The Confederates behind the Rapidan. The Federals have advanced from Culpeper. They've sent the 5th Corps and the 1st Corps down to the Rapidan so that the Federal cavalry could go over to Madison County. So Meade's deeper into the Culpeper V than he was before, and Lee sees an opportunity. And he begins to take advantage of it on the 8th by shifting his troops to the west. And you can see here he's going to leave some cavalry, Fitz-Lee's cavalry, and 1 brigade of infantry to man the Rapidan to try and fool the Federals into thinking we haven't gone anywhere. And remember, the ground here is higher than in Culpeper, so the Federals don't know what's on the other side of those hills. Okay? So you get Stuart's cavalry division. Stuart's cavalry divisions become a corps now. It became a corps on September 19th. And so he's got Wade Hampton's division with him. Wade Hampton's still recovering from Gettysburg wounds. So Stuart is in personal command. He gets Ewell's corps over here to Orange Courthouse, and he's got Hill and Orange and Ewell here. And they are preparing to do the thing that Meade knows would be the most dangerous to him, and that's to go around his flank, to go into Madison County and either swing in to hit him in Culpeper or get north of him and try and cut him off from Richmond. The Federals are vaguely aware that the Confederates are doing something, but they don't know what they're doing. And there are 2 primary options. Lee's going over to the offensive, he's going to outflank us, or he's going to pull back to Richmond. Pulling back to Richmond makes more sense, as badly outnumbered as he is. But this is Lee. So he could be going over to the offensive, his old tricks that he's used in the Antietam and the Gettysburg Campaign. And so Meade doesn't know what to do. And it doesn't help that he's very aware that Lincoln and Halleck and Stanton are staring over his shoulder, still disgruntled with his failure to engage Lee since Gettysburg. And of course, we all know that when somebody's looking over your shoulder, even the most confident thing you are capable of, you do a little less well, if not poorly, right? None of us like to be watched while we are about our business. And so Meade hedges his bets. He takes cavalry and he puts it over here along Robinson's River, which is the border between Madison County and Culpeper. Madison County, Culpeper. It's not much of a river. It's a river when it rains really hard. And if it hadn't rained hard, it's a nice little creek. So it's not much of a military obstacle. But he's going to throw cavalry over here, but he sends another corps down to the Rapidan. He sends the 5th Corps down to the Rapidan to back up the 6th and the 1st Corps, and then he orders Buford's cavalry to leave Stevensburg to go down and cross the Rapidan at Germanna Ford, and then move up the west bank toward Morton's Ford, where the 1st Corps is. And what's supposed to happen is that Buford will uncover the ford, the 1st and the 5th Corps will cross the Rapidan, they'll move to the next ford and allow the 6th Corps to cross, and then those infantry corps will stay there while Buford goes down to Orange Courthouse to see what Lee is doing. So the idea is, if Lee is in retreat, this is the beginning of a pursuit. And Meade is very conscious of the fact that he cannot let Lee escape the Rapidan without a pursuit and hopefully without a battle, because he had let Lee get across the Potomac without a battle or much of a pursuit. He let him get out of the Shenandoah without a battle or much of a pursuit. Let that happen a 3rd time, George Meade's in the unemployment line. And he knows it, and he doesn't want to be there. So he hopes that Buford is going to uncover something and let him know what's going on. But now the bad luck that always seems to accompany the Army of the Potomac kicks in. Pleasanton sends the order to Buford to make this river crossing. That order is supposed to get to Buford by 8 o'clock on the night of October 9th. It doesn't get to him until 8 o'clock in the morning on October 10th. And so when Buford moves, he's 12 hours late. Meade thinks at dawn on the 10th, he's already over the Rapidan. He's just starting toward the Rapidan, and it's going to be most of the day before any news could possibly be delivered by Buford back to Meade's headquarters at Culpeper Courthouse. Lee, on the other hand, during this time, has begun to swing through Madison County. Stuart has spilled over the Robertson River. He's captured or run off the federal observation post on Thoroughfare Mountain, so the Federals are blind to what the Confederates are doing. Stuart spends a whole day skirmishing around Drain City, and that keeps Kilpatrick's entire cavalry division busy. Buford, of course, has tried to cross the Rapidan, and the Gregg's cavalry division is guarding the Federal rear. So the Federals are basically blind to what the rebels are doing. And over the course of the day, Meade is getting more nervous. He's heard nothing from Buford. What's happened to Buford? He sends word to the 6th Corps and asks Sedgwick, have you heard from Buford? Heard nothing. Sends word to the 1st Corps. He asks Newton, have you heard anything from Buford? And Newton says, I haven't heard anything. We haven't seen anything. Sykes in the 5th Corps, same answer. What does that mean? All of the fighting seems to be happening out here to the west. And Meade's gut is, Lee is flanking me. But he can't completely trust that gut, knowing that everybody's looking over his shoulder, fearful that the Confederates might actually be pulling back. This could be a giant feint. So what do? Well, finally, at 4:30 in the afternoon of the 10th, Meade makes up his mind. Lee's not retreating. Lee's flanking me. He orders his infantry back to Culpeper, and he sends a rider after Buford to tell him, get back across the river and rejoin the army around Culpeper Courthouse. That courier is not going to make it to Buford until dawn of the next day. Buford, late in the evening, gets over here to Morton's Ford, drives off a small Confederate picket force, looks around for the 1st Corps, which is supposed to be on the other side of the river, to cross and join him, and there's nobody there. And he has no idea what's happened to the Army of the Potomac. So he bivouacs for the night, and while he bivouacs, Fitz Lee gets word that he is on our side of the river and begins to move against him so he can attack him at dawn. After midnight, the Army of the Potomac does the only thing that it really can do in this circumstance, and that's get the hell out of Culpeper County. You don't want to stay there. If Lee's on your flank and he comes storming down onto you from the west, he's going to push you into that narrow V, going to push you back up against the Rappahannock River. And if you lose a battle, you lose your army probably at the same time, or at least a good chunk of it. So Meade orders his army to retreat, to get north of the Rappahannock River where it can turn and make a stand. On the morning of October 11th, the action starts to pick up. So Fitz Lee attacks Buford, who's at Morton's Ford. He's finally got a messenger that tells him what's going on. He's got to get back across the Rappahannock. The problem is that Morton's Ford hasn't been used by anybody for some 6 months. And so it's in very poor condition. His engineers have to corduroy the road down to it and cut the banks down so he can get his artillery across it. And in the meantime, he's got to put up a fight. He knows that Fitz Lee isn't just going to launch a frontal attack, and Fitz Lee hasn't. He sent another brigade or two of cavalry across the river to hit Buford in the rear. Buford has sent one of his brigades to meet that, and so you get fighting on both banks of the Rapidan River. Pretty dramatic stuff, but Buford manages to hold his own. He gets back across the river and begins to retreat toward Culpeper with Fitz Lee in pursuit. At the same time, Stuart has gone toward Culpeper Courthouse, where Kilpatrick's division is stationed to be a rear guard. Lee's infantry is still coming up. Of course, it's many hours behind the Confederate cavalry. And so you get a very, very interesting situation. This is something that Steven Spielberg could do wonderful things with. So you've got Kilpatrick's division retreating from Culpeper toward Brandy Station and the Rappahannock River. Stuart, who is now down to only like 7 regiments that are actually with him because of detachments he's made, can't really push Kilpatrick much from the rear, so he's trying to outflank him. At the same time, Buford's coming up from the Rapidan, trying to get to Brandy Station, and Fitz Lee is following him. And this is all pretty much open country. Most of the woods have been cut down. There are these huge vistas you can see for miles. And the people who lived through this said it was the most remarkable sight. 4 cavalry divisions, all within sight of each other, on the move, in column with their wagons, their artillery, Everybody going at the gallop, the Federals running, the Confederates chasing. It was a spectacle to behold. Unfortunately for the Confederates, Buford has got the head start, and he's going to get up here to Fleetwood Heights at Brandy Station before anybody else. Fitz Lee, who's chasing him, however, sees Kilpatrick's column making its way in the same direction, but it can't see Stuart. He's too far away. So Fitz Lee takes his artillery and he starts to try and shell Kilpatrick, and some of his rounds are going over Kilpatrick and they're hitting Stuart instead. And so Stuart says, well, the best way to let Fitz know I'm a friend is to come down and attack the Federal column. And so Stuart, with Hampton's troops, comes tearing down onto the road to hit Kilpatrick from the north. Fitz Lee, who's not managed to catch Buford, sees the opportunity to cut Kilpatrick off and separate him from Buford. And so you get a very dramatic moment where the Confederates under Stuart are harassing the Federal flank and rear. Fitz Lee's racing to try and get up here. He's only going to get 2 regiments in front of the Federals, but he does cut the road. And at that point, Kilpatrick and Pleasanton is with him till where's George Custer's brigade to cut through. They form columns of squadrons, 2 regiments side by side, and they go charging across the plain toward the Confederates, who of course you don't have the strength to stop them, and the Federals are able to push the Confederates aside, get to Brandy Station, join Buford, and for the rest of the day you've got this really big cavalry action, seesawing back and forth, mounted charges, fighting on foot, encirclements and breaking out of encirclements. It's really neat stuff, but none of it is going to allow the Confederates to destroy 2/3 of the Federal cavalry. But nonetheless, the Federal cavalry retreats because it's supposed to get across the Rappahannock and join the rest of the Army of the Potomac. And as the Federals retreat, the infantry that had been supporting Fitz Lee shows up on the scene, and the Federals see them. They see foot soldiers, men wearing knapsacks, which of course cavalry does not do. And so they get the impression that rebel infantry is there with the Confederate cavalry. And that's true, but it's a brigade. It's not the main force of the Army of Northern Virginia, although the Federals don't know that. They couldn't know that. So what happens is that by the end of the day on October 11th, the Federals are north of the Rappahannock. Lee's infantry is now coming up on Culpeper Courthouse, and he's very disappointed. He had hoped to catch Meade in the Culpeper V and have the advantage of doing that, but Meade has gotten away. And so now Lee has to decide what to do. Does he fall back across the Rapidan, or does he continue his offensive? And we know Robert E. Lee, so it's pretty easy to predict what he's going to do. He's going to continue his offensive. So he sends his wagon trains well to the west, and on the morning of October 12th, he takes his infantry in 2 columns, Hill moving to the west and Ewell to the east, and he begins to head toward the upper Rappahannock at Sulphur Springs and Waterloo Bridge. Meade has stationed a brigade of cavalry out here, or it's a whole division actually. David Gregg's division's out here, but one brigade of cavalry is at a little town called Jeffersonton, which is right across the path that Ewell's going to follow. And the job of the Federal cavalry is reconnaissance. You're a tripwire. You're out there looking for Confederate infantry. You see Confederate infantry, don't fight, retreat, and tell Meade as quick as you can. But this march is taking longer than Lee wants it to, and so most of the day goes by, and the Federal cavalry sees nobody. The 1st Maine is sent to make sure the Confederates aren't going even further west, and they make this long march, and they don't see anybody. In the meantime, Meade is sitting on the other side of the Rappahannock River with his entire army, wondering where the Confederates have gone, because nobody's seen any rebel infantry since October 8th. And Gregg out here is not reporting any. If Lee's trying to outflank me, Gregg should have seen them by now, and he hasn't. And we've got these reports from Kilpatrick and Buford that they saw rebels wearing knapsacks yesterday evening around Culpeper. And so Meade now begins to second guess himself. His staff pretty much says, well, this proves that this whole business has been some giant feint. It's Stuart fooling us, so Lee retreats closer to Richmond and he's gotten away from us. Meade, however, hopes that what this means is that the Confederate Army is concentrated around Culpeper. The Confederates have walked into the Culpeper V trap now, and I have an opportunity. So at noon, he finally decides, I'm going to go back. And he sends John Sedgwick with the 6th Corps, the 2nd Corps, and the 5th Corps, and Buford's cavalry. He sends them back into Culpeper County, back across the Rappahannock, undoing everything he'd done the night before, to find out if the Army of Northern Virginia is around Culpeper and willing to fight. The only thing that's around Culpeper is a single Confederate cavalry brigade under Brigadier General Pierce Young, about 600 guys. And when they see 3 Federal Corps and a cavalry division coming at them, they, of course, scream for help. And they put up a pretty good delaying action as they back up toward Culpeper. Stuart gets the plea for help, but he says, you got nothing to worry about. Meade's going to be the one worrying before very long when he figures out where we are. He'll leave you alone. That is, of course, cold comfort to General Young. Nonetheless, he's not wrong, because Sedgwick and Buford, who know their business, realize all we got in front of us is a Confederate cavalry brigade. Lee's infantry's not here. We can't tell you where it's gone, but we know it's not here. And so when Meade hears that, he goes, he gave me the slip. He's on his way to Richmond. He's long gone. Very clever of the old gray fox. And he tells Sedgwick, okay, bed your men down, and we'll figure out what we're going to do tomorrow. So as night falls on October 12th, half the Army of the Potomac is going to go to sleep north of the Rappahannock, and half of it's going to go to sleep south of the Rappahannock inside the Culpeper V. Very unfortunate for Meade, because we know where Lee is at. His cavalry comes up on Jefferson, comes up on it so fast, the Federal cavalry is forced to fight. They try to send a messenger back as soon as they see rebel infantry. The messenger is shot, has his horse shot, he's wounded, he's captured, so he doesn't get back to General Gregg. The Confederates overwhelm the Federal cavalry, and then they move up on Sulphur Springs, and they bounce across the river, mauling a couple of Gregg's cavalry regiments, forcing him to retreat. And it won't be until 9 o'clock that night that one of the survivors of that fight gets to Meade's headquarters and says, A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell are on the north bank of the Rappahannock River. They're on your flank, and they are closer to the railroad behind you than you are. And Meade suddenly realizes, oh my gosh, I am in trouble. Look where the rebels are. Look where I am. And he immediately sends word to Sedgwick, wake everybody up and get yourself across the river as fast as you can go, because there's only one option for us now, and that is to make helter-skelter pace toward Washington. Because if we don't, the Confederates are going to get behind us, and they're going to cut the railroad, and we're going to be out here without a line of supply or communication, and that is going to end very badly. Sedgwick, of course, is a very competent fellow. He gets his men up, 30,000 of them, gets them moving. And so the Federals spend the night of the 12th doing two things: getting half the army above the Rappahannock and getting the other half into position to resist a Confederate flank attack if it should come roaring down on the railroad in the morning. The retreat goes on all night. This is the bridge at Rappahannock Station. There's also a ford there. These are the Federals retreating across the river. Once they get everybody across the river, they burn the railroad bridge. They just rebuilt it at the beginning of August as part of their offensive intentions. Now they burn it and they go, pelting up the railroad. Meade is trying to move expeditiously, so he divides his army into two columns. Half the army is going to retreat directly up the railroad. The other is going to move off to the west, and it's going to move through a little crossroads village called Auburn, north of which there is a very prominent hill, and this is a creek called Cedar Run. And this place is like a lot of Civil War places. It's a couple of buildings. There's nothing important about it all. Well, except the Stephen McCormick, who invented the McCormick plow, lives there. And that's where he invented the plow and where he had built all those plows. So historically speaking, this place is huge. Okay? But by October of 1863, it doesn't matter about that at all. What matters is there are 5 roads that come together there. And the Army of the Potomac is going to use one of those roads called the Old Carolina Road, dates back to the colonial period, to come up on Auburn, and then it's either going to swing back toward the railroad or it's going to keep going north toward Manassas and Centerville. Lee, of course, has concentrated his infantry at Warrenton, and you can see that if Lee wants to go north, he's going to have to send at least part of his army through Auburn. If he wants to attack the railroad, he's going to have to go through Auburn. So Auburn suddenly matters a very great deal. On the afternoon of October 13th, the Federal 3rd Corps, led by Major General William French, followed by the Federal 2nd Corps under the command of Gouverneur Warren, who has just taken over for the wounded Winfield Scott Hancock, who of course been injured during Pickett's charge, along with Gregg and Kilpatrick's cavalry divisions, come marching up the road toward Auburn. Ewell is in Warrenton, Hill is still coming up, and Fitz-Lee is still coming up, but Jeb Stuart with Hampton's division is there. And Lee has sent him to the east to find the Army of the Potomac, because now Lee doesn't know where the Yankees are. So we flip the coin over. Meade knows more or less where Lee is, but Lee doesn't really know where Meade is anymore. And so Stuart's job with Hampton's division is to find out. So he goes into Auburn. He goes to the top of this hill. He looks south, and he sees these Federal columns coming up. But when he sees them, he can't really get a good view of the head of the columns because of these woods, but he sees them on this road, and it looks to him like they're heading toward the railroad. They're not. That's what Stuart thinks. So he leaves Lomax's brigade in Auburn to hold his rear, and he takes 2 other brigades down toward the railroad to see what he can see. Well, this isn't going to work out for Jeb Stuart very well, because he gets down to the railroad, finds a great vantage point. He can see the origin of Alexandria. He can see an awful lot of Yankee infantry. And most interestingly, he sees the primary reserve wagon train of the entire Army of the Potomac. 1,100 wagons, all bunched together in one spot. This is a Confederate's Christmas night dream, right? All of those wagons with white top canvas covers. It said it looked like it took 300 acres to park them all in one place. And it said it looked like a field covered in snow. And Stuart is sorely tempted to go after those wagons. But he knows, nah, I can't do that. There's a lot of Yankee infantry down there, and I could scare them and I could discombobulate them, but most of them will get away from me. I won't be able to really plunder them, and I will give away the position. Okay? What we need is the infantry to be here, to go storming down on that railroad at dawn and catch the Army of the Potomac on the march. So he secrets his 2 brigades of cavalry and his 1 battery of artillery, and he sends a courier back to tell Lee, if you can move tonight, we have this wonderful opportunity. And when the courier gets back to Auburn, he's surprised because Lomax isn't there anymore. But a whole corps of Federal infantry is marching through the place, along with the division of Yankee cavalry. Kilpatrick's cavalry, French's infantry, having brushed Lomax aside, Gregg and Warren following, and it's just a solid traffic jam of Yankee troops. And so the aide goes north to try and get around. He sends a courier back to Stuart, like, excuse me, you have a problem. And Stuart's, what's going on? He turns around, he goes back to Auburn, he gets there, and the Yankees are still on the road, and suddenly Stuart realizes, I'm caught between the 2 halves of the Army of the Potomac. And the only good thing about that is it's dark and they don't know I'm here. But Stuart sees opportunity. So he sends a series of messengers to Lee. He says, there are Yankees moving through Auburn. I'm on their eastern flank. If you could attack them at dawn from the west, we'll catch them in a vice and we'll destroy them. It's going to be 1 a.m. before Meade gets the first of those messengers. And when Lee hears that, he's like, great. Tomorrow I was going to go launching everybody toward Manassas to try and cut off the whole Army of the Potomac. And now I've got to go rescue Jeb Stuart. But he doesn't want to completely give up his offensive. So he tells Hill, you start marching north. I'm going to send Ewell to help Stuart. And Stuart secrets his troops in a little valley, keeps them hidden all night long. This is, again, really dramatic stuff. Men stationed at the head of every mule to keep it quiet. The Yankees are marching north, right over there. You can see their lanterns and their bonfires, and you hear them. But toward dawn, All that noise stops because Warren in the Second Corps has decided he's tired of eating French's dust. And he bivouacs his troops to let French get a little bit more north of him. So Gregg and Warren go to sleep along the Carolina Road, no idea that Stuart is over here or that Ewell is going to be marching toward Auburn in the morning. And during the night, a courier gets to Warren from Meade, and he says, I don't want you to follow French north. I want you to go to Auburn and then turn east and move down toward the railroad and become the rear guard of the army. And so what does that mean? It means when he gets to Auburn and he turns east, he's got to be pointing right toward Jeb Stuart's hiding place. Okay. What follows on the morning of October 14th, you can see where the armies are here. There's the Confederate infantry. There's Stuart. Kilpatrick and French are now well to the north. Most of the Army of the Potomac is down here around Catlin Station, preparing to retreat up the railroad. And there is the Second Corps and Gregg's Cavalry Division. It's a very, very sticky kind of situation. And what happens, and we don't really have time to go into it in detail, is that as the Confederates begin to move that morning, Ewell going to the north and then heading east to try and cut the railroad at a place called Bristoe Station, the Federals retreating up the railroad trying to evade that trap. Ewell is coming in to rescue Stuart, who's waiting for Confederate infantry to attack from the west so he can spring a trap from the east. And the Second Corps and Gregg's Cavalry Division are in between those two forces, and they have no idea that either one of them is there. So on the morning of October 14th, Ewell's infantry begins to come in. It runs into a Yankee outpost. It advances toward Gregg's cavalry, and a skirmish starts. Lomax's cavalry advances. There's a lot of gunfire here. Stuart in his hiding place hears all of that, and he says, aha, Lee got my message, and he is enacting my plan. Not quite, but Stuart, believing that that's what's going on, wheels his guns out, and he opens fire on a Federal division under John Caldwell, which has climbed to the top of this tall hill just north of Auburn, where Stuart had been looking at the Yankees the day before. And of course, the Federals have put artillery there, but it's been pointing toward Warrenton, where they think the enemy is. No idea that the Confederates are behind them. And so all the Yankees have stacked arms, and they're cooking breakfast, and they're making their coffee, and all of a sudden, 4 of Jeb Stuart's artillery pieces open fire. And the shooting is very good. The first shell explodes over a campfire and kills 4 guys, just like that. The Confederates begin to bombard the hill. The Yankees pick up their food and their weapons, and they run to the reverse slope of the hill to get out of the fire. And from that point forward, that hill will always be known as Coffee Hill by the Union Army. It's a name that it still has today. That's a drawing of it. There's Mr. McCormick's house. You can see that's almost the entirety of the village of Auburn right there. There's one other little building, and that's all that there is. But the Federals are retreating to the other side of the hill, and as they do that, the firing to the west stops because the Confederates have run into unexpected resistance, and Stuart's like, uh-oh, I just gave away where I was. And more than that, the Yankees are not going north the way they did. They are turning east and coming right down on my position. And so Stuart says, we've got to get out of here, and I need to buy time. So he sends the 1st North Carolina Cavalry to make a desperate charge against Yankee infantry to hold them at bay. That's going to get the commander of the regiment mortally wounded. But it does work. It stuns the Federals long enough for Stuart to get out of the way, and he actually manages to find a place to cross Cedar Run and evade. But now the Federals are in a panic. There are Confederates to the west of us. There are Confederates to the east of us. We're surrounded. And it's a very foggy morning, and you can't really see very well. And this is really rugged terrain, and the muzzle flashes and the cannon flashes are going everywhere. And so Warren is racing down to Gregg, and he's saying, for God's sake, you've got to hold the enemy back, even if you lose your entire division. And then he tells some of his infantry, you've got to hold the bridge over this creek, even if you lose your entire brigade. We've got to get out of here. Ewell's coming up, meeting all this resistance, and he's looking around. He says, oh my God, this is a horrible place for offensive action. There's high ground everywhere, and there are these fences, and I'm not going to make a frontal attack into the teeth of the Federals. So instead, I'm going to try and outflank them. I'm going to send one division under Rhodes to the right. I'm going to send another under Early across the creek to the north while Johnson comes in, and we'll try and surround the Yankees. And of course, this is all very terrifying and scary for the Federals, but they're steadily clocking toward the Orange and Alexandria. So they are like air rushing from a balloon. They're escaping even as the Confederates are trying to get at them. And although there are some very dicey moments, the Confederates get a lot of artillery up there. They start laying down a bombardment. Early does manage to get over and begin to advance toward the Federals who are retreating, but only the couple of regiments at the rear get caught up in it. And they lose some prisoners, and there's a little bit of a running fight, but Warren manages to get away and head toward the Orange and Alexandria. Ewell's orders are, as soon as Stuart is relieved, and Stuart now circles around and he's safe, you leave the Federals alone and you head north to support A.P. Hill. So the Federals have gone east, the Confederates are now turning north. Stuart is supposed to get on the flank of the Confederate infantry, be between the Army of the Potomac on the railroad and the Confederate infantry to the west, and be a buffer and to tell Lee what's going on there. But Stuart has basically slept 1 hour in the last 48. He's completely exhausted. His men are completely exhausted. And he misunderstands what's going on. So Ewell sends a sharpshooter battalion to poke at the Federal rear guard, Warren's rear guard. And Stuart sees that and he thinks, well, that's the way the Second Corps is going to go. So he follows them. So he's going after the Union rear guard, and there's no buffer. There's no cavalry between the two armies, which means that when the Confederate infantry turns toward the railroad, it's not going to know what's in front of it. Ewell is leading the charge. He is following in the path of the Third Corps, and he's hard on its heels. He comes up, the campfires are still warm. There's Federal stragglers that are being picked up. There's stuff that the Federals have been tossing aside, knapsacks and haversacks and all kinds of things. This looks like a Yankee rout. And the Confederates, one of them says, we get caught up in the chase. This is like boys chasing a hare. We've got the Yankees on the run. They're afraid of us. Gettysburg be damned. They're still terrified of the Army of Northern Virginia. And so in the spirit of the chase, the Confederates swing down toward the railroad at Bristoe Station. And by this point, most of the Union infantry is already out of the trap, but the 5th Corps is just coming up on Bristoe. And the 2nd Corps, delayed by its fight at Auburn, is following the 5th Corps. The Union wagon trains under Buford are moving well off to the east here. And so you have Hill following the 3rd Corps thinking he's chasing the Union rear guard. It's not the Union rear guard. It's a long way from being the Union rear guard. Meade has ordered his corps to stay within supporting distance of each other. He knows that the great danger is his long strung out column gets hit while on the move, and if a part of his army is isolated, Lee's going to overwhelm it and destroy it. So these corps are supposed to stay within supporting distance of each other. So the 5th Corps gets north of a creek called Broad Run at Bristoe Station. It actually crosses over here at a little ford that's right over here and at Milford. And George Sykes waits. He's very, 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 very nervous. He's afraid he's going to get cut off. He's going to get overwhelmed. He keeps sending these messages to Warren. Where are you? Hurry up. The 3rd Corps is still marching north. There's a bigger gap between me and the 3rd Corps, and I ought to close that up. And you have a very nervous George Sykes. And the consequence of that is that when a patrol from the 2nd Corps shows up, a mile or more ahead of the actual column, Sykes sees it, this little patrol, he says, "There's the 2nd Corps, we're leaving." And he begins to pull out to the north, which would always leave the men of the 2nd Corps with a bitter feeling. As one of them said, Sykes was told the 2nd Corps was coming, and so it was. And so was Christmas. So the 5th Corps is beginning to bug out. The 2nd Corps is just beginning to come up on Bristoe Station. And the leading element of Hill's Corps, 10th Infantry Division, is coming up toward Bristoe as well. And Hill rides in front of his troops, and he gets to this little plateau where there's a nice shopping center now. And he stops and he looks across this great big plain, and he sees this horde of Union stragglers waiting to cross the river up here at the little Milford, which is just a grist mill. And he thinks he's looking at the Union rear guard. And it's about to give him the slip. He doesn't look to the south. He can't see Warren. He doesn't know that he's there. Stuart's not there to tell him. He's got no cavalry with him. Fitz-Lee's gone north after Kilpatrick and French. But he does see a lot of stragglers, so he tells his infantry to hurry up. He brings up a battery of artillery. They go into position there, and they open fire on all these Yankee stragglers. They create an enormous panic. The Confederates are just delighted at this. Look at all the yellow bellies running around, scared out of their wits. But as that's happening, the Second Corps is coming up from the south. And Gouverneur Warren, of course, had been the chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac before he became a corps commander. He knows the railroad, he knows this terrain, and he knows that there is a railroad embankment here at Bristoe Station. It's about 6 feet tall, and the Orange and Alexandria track runs on top of it, and it is a natural breastwork. And so he orders his infantry to get behind that natural breastwork as soon as it can. His artillery is going to begin to deploy on this high ground here. But the interesting thing is that as the Confederates come up, Hill is very, very, very much in a hurry. And he takes Heth's division and he says, I want you to deploy 3 of your brigades, 2 of them very big, Kirkland and Cook. They hadn't been at Gettysburg. They had been in the Richmond defenses. These are really big brigades. And you've got the brigade of Joe Davis and Walker here. And he says, I want you to advance into the plain. When you get into the plain, you're going to move by your left flank. You're going to cross at Milford, and you got to pursue the retreating Yankees. So the Confederates begin to move into this plain, but as they do, they run into the skirmishers that Warren is throwing out. And suddenly there's all these Yankee skirmishers down here where they shouldn't be. And General Cook, who's a veteran, halts his troops. Kirkland halts his. He sends word back to Heth, there's Yankee skirmishers off to our right. And if there's Yankee skirmishers out there, they are screening something. And I don't think we should ignore them. And Heth looks at that and he says, I think you're right. Let's tell Hill. And he sends word to Hill. And Hill looks and he says, okay, but the Yankees are getting away, and this is probably really nothing to worry about. But he waits for 10 minutes. He waits for the head of Anderson's division to peek over the horizon and before he's going to give the order to move again, which is too bad because if he had moved toward the railroad in those 10 minutes, the Confederates would have been at the railroad embankment waiting for the Second Corps. But he doesn't. He sits there for those 10 minutes. And when the 10 minutes are up, he orders Heth to resume his movement in pursuit of Sykes' fleeing Fifth Corps because Anderson will come up and he'll deal with whatever this is. So as the Confederates begin to move out into this plain, Webb's division of the Second Corps is coming up. It's going into line behind the railroad. And as the Confederates move out here, they begin to take fire. And the fire is significant enough that Cook drops off a regiment to deal with it. That's not enough. And he says, okay, I've got to turn my whole brigade toward whatever's there along the railroad. And as he pivots toward the railroad, Kirkland is forced to pivot with him. Walker keeps going toward Milford in the direction that he was supposed to go. So there's this idea that the Confederates walked into this clever Federal trap at Bristoe. There's no trap here. This wasn't premeditated. Everybody's moving at the same time. The situation is incredibly fluid. 10 minutes is the difference between who's going to have the advantage here and who's going to have the disadvantage here. And as Cook and Kirkland wheel toward the railroad, the Federal artillery is coming up and begins to open fire. Hayes' division, 2 brigades of it anyway, show up. They see the Federal skirmishers being driven in. Hayes orders his men to run for the railroad cut and take position. The Confederates swing toward the railroad and they begin to advance on the railroad. Cook is hit. He's going to lose a leg. He's down. Colonel Edward Hall takes over his brigade. They're standing there. They're taking fire from Federal infantry. They're taking fire from Federal artillery. Heth has ordered, or Hill has ordered artillery to come up and try and support the Confederate infantry. It's on its way. But Hall is sitting there and he says, well, we got to do one or two things. We can't stay where we're at. We go back or we go forward. And I expect we ought to go forward. And so the Confederates advance toward the railroad. And this is not some grand picket charge kind of thing. This is spontaneous. It is not a solid line. Kirkland is conforming. The Confederates are just sort of reacting to circumstances. They don't know what's really there. And of course, what's there are 4 Federal brigades waiting for 2 Confederate brigades with 3.5 batteries of artillery backing the Yankees up. And the Confederates are shot to pieces. That sums it up pretty well. Some of them get right up to the railroad embankment where the road crosses the railroad. There is no embankment. The Confederates actually break through there, and there's a little bit of hand-to-hand combat. They outflank the Federals with a couple of companies, but there's just too much artillery. There's too much Yankee infantry, and the Confederates are shot up, and they are forced to retreat. It is a partially organized, partially disorganized retreat as they go back. The Federals swing brigade off to hit them in the flank. You see here's Anderson coming up. Now Caldwell's division, which was the actual Union rear guard, and Gregg's cavalry division are coming up to reinforce the Federal line. It's getting very close to dark. Lee and Ewell reach the scene. They try and get Anderson in position and Early in a position to where that they can launch an attack, but they don't really know what Federals are in front of them. And it turns out there are a lot of Yankees in front of them. Now, to be sure, this is an isolated Federal corps, and you got the entire Army of Northern Union in front of it, but they don't know that. And the terrain is on the side of the Federals. And now it's dark, and the effort to try and hit the Federal flank goes awry, in part because you're running out of daylight, but also because John Gordon, who has the biggest brigade in Early's division, is getting in position here to attack the Federal flank, waiting for the rest of Early's brigades to come up. But then he sees the Union wagon trains under Gregg and Buford off to his south, and they are moving. And he does what Stuart refused to do the day before. He goes chasing Yankee wagons. And those wagons get away from him. But it puts him completely out of the loop, and there's no way that Early can attack without his largest brigade. Total darkness now. The battle comes to an end. Overnight, the Federals manage to sneak away. It's very windy. They're very quiet. They slink away. The next morning, the Confederates wake up and they charge the railroad cut, and there's nobody there. Warren has given them the slip. The Yankee infantry marches all night. It gets across Bull Run, gets up to Centerville, defenses. Stuart's cavalry follows. There's some heavy skirmishing along Bull Run. The idea here is, of course, to scare the Yankees into thinking that Lee is still under pursuit. But in fact, Lee has stopped his army at Bristoe Station. He's done what he can do. He could outflank the Federals again, but if he does that, they're going to retreat into the defenses of Washington. And it's almost winter, and he can't invade the North again in those conditions. He can't stay in Northern Virginia because Richmond cannot supply him that far north. And after 2 years of war, the countryside is a desert. So there's only one thing left to do, and that is to pull back. Stuart will keep Meade nervous as long as he can, but we are going to retreat. And as we retreat, we will destroy the railroad. Because without the railroad, Meade cannot pursue us because he won't have a line of sight. I have to rebuild the railroad. Meade, of course, is very nervous. Stuart's making him even more nervous. It looks like the Confederates might be flanking him again. There are reports that the rebels are moving into the Shenandoah Valley. Imboden's cavalry brigade has attacked the Union garrison at Charlestown and captured it. And that looks like, oh no, here we go, across the Potomac again. And so Meade sits a day or two trying to figure out what's going on. Halleck is badgering him. Meade's saying, Lee's got 80,000 men. And Halleck's like, no, he doesn't. He's got like 50,000 guys. All of our intelligence says he's got 50,000 guys. Why do you think he has 80? And really what Meade's thinking is, I wouldn't attack 88,000 men with 50, so surely Lee won't do that. So he's operating on a delusion here, not as bad as McClellan's delusion, but bad enough under the circumstances. And by the time that Meade figured this out, it started to rain. And really rain. And Bull Run is flooded into a miniature Rhine River. Too swift a current and too wide for the Federal pontoon wagons, which have had a very rough time on the retreat anyway, to bridge. And so Meade is not able to advance until the 18th of October. That same day, Lee crosses the upper Rappahannock into Culpeper County. He's already gone. But Lee doesn't know that. Meade doesn't know that. So he's pursuing, and he's coming down the railroad, but he's also moving off to the west, down the Warrenton Turnpike, with Kilpatrick's cavalry division ahead of a couple of Federal infantry corps, and Kilpatrick runs into Stuart Worthampton's division around a little town called Buckland Mills. And here again, you've got a Broad Run, which is the same creek that runs down to Bristoe Station. And the Confederates put up a good little fight here. Alfred Wood was on hand to draw it. That's the Federal artillery firing on the town. That's the Confederate artillery firing back. It's a little bit of a stalemate. And off to the east, you have Federals pushing down the railroad with Fitz-Lee's cavalry division, trying to slow them down. But the Federals are pretty much all infantry, and so Fitz-Lee's got a lot of room to maneuver, and he's at Bristoe Station. He's in communication with Stuart by signal flag. Countryside's fairly open. And when Fitz-Lee learns what is happening at Buckland, he suggests, as he says, a little stratagem to Stuart. I'll come up toward Buckland Mills. You feign a retreat. You head back toward Baltimore. And the Federals will follow you. And when they follow you, I'll come up behind them. And when you hear my guns open up, you turn around and attack, and we've got them in a vice, and we're going to destroy Yankee cavalry division. And Stuart says, I like that idea a lot. And so he begins to retreat. Kilpatrick is anxious to follow. Custer's brigade had been doing the fighting here at Buckland. So Davies' brigade takes the lead, and Kilpatrick wants Custer to follow. And Custer's like, no, I'm not going to follow right away. My men are hungry. They haven't had breakfast. I'm going to stop and eat breakfast before we follow you. And Kilpatrick finally says, okay, have your breakfast and then follow us. And that turns out to be really bad luck for the Confederates, because what it means is that when Fitz-Lee comes up toward Buckland thinking there'll be nobody there, Custer's there. Now, that's one brigade facing a Confederate cavalry division, so Custer's not very happy about this either, right? But Fitz-Lee runs into Custer. This starts a fight, and Davies hears that, and Stuart hears it, and Davies says, what's going on behind me? I better go find out. So he turns his men around just as Stuart launches an attack. And so suddenly, what had been the Federal advance is its rear guard as Davies is trying to get back to Custer. Fitz-Lee's trying to cut Custer off, and he does cut him off. And so Davies, cut off from Custer, has to make this flight across country for almost 5 miles back toward Haymarket and Union infantry, while Custer makes a run toward Gainesville and Union infantry. The Confederates are chasing the Yankees, and the Yankees are running as fast as they can. Custer's headquarters wagon is captured with a lot of spicy correspondence with his wife. That's a really salacious metaphor. If you ever read it, it is like really salacious metaphor. And the Richmond papers are going to publish all of it and have fun with that. The Confederates call this the Buckland Races, as they chase the Yankees back 6 miles. And Custer says this is the worst day in the history of the 3rd Cavalry Division. It's really the point where he loses faith in Kilpatrick. He thought Kilpatrick was a good general until this, and after this, no, Kilpatrick is not a good general. But it's very embarrassing for the Federals, right? The Confederates have chased them all the way back to their infantry supports, and Kilpatrick has to explain that. And we all, I think, know Kilpatrick is not the guy whose picture is next to the word veracity in the dictionary. Right? So he tells Meade, I was attacked by Confederate infantry. Yes, there was a whole bunch of Confederate infantry at Buckland. And that's why what happened to me happened to me. And so Meade says, aha, I finally know where Lee's infantry is. It's not backing up toward Culpeper. It's backing up toward Warrenton and New Baltimore. And so I have an opportunity here. And he takes all of his troops away from the railroad and he shifts them onto the Warrenton Pike, preparing to launch a massive attack on the Confederates. He lines his corps up one behind the other, and he starts them on the morning of October 20th toward Buckland and New Baltimore, ready to have the final battle that will finish off the Gettysburg Campaign. And of course, there's nothing there. So just like at Falling Waters in mid-July, just like Manassas Gap at the end of July, now on the Warrenton Pike, the Federal Army of the Potomac throws a punch into thin air. Stuart is not even there. He's fled back toward the Rappahannock to join the Confederate infantry. And Meade finally realizes what's happened. He has to send word to Halleck and Lincoln and Stanton. Oh, well, Lee gave me the slip again. Sorry about that. We're going to shift back over to the railroad. But that railroad ain't what it was, because the Confederates have thoroughly destroyed. You see this picture in a lot of books, and a lot of times they're like, oh, this is what Sherman's doing. There were no photographers with Sherman on the march to the sea. This is taken in the Bristoe Station campaign. This is what the Army in Northern Virginia did after Bristoe Station. They tore up the ties, they laid the rails on top of them, they set them on fire, they warped them to where they were useless, they cut down the telegraph poles, they burned every bridge, destroyed every culvert, they took all the telegraph wire. The Federals who marched into this say, I have never seen anything so completely destroyed as the Orange and Alexandria Railroad after Lee got done with it. And what Lee is hoping, of course, is that it will take the Yankees months to rebuild this. They do it in 3 weeks. So, if you hope that this is the end of the campaigning season because the Yankees won't be able to do anything because they're gonna have plenty of time by early November to resume their offensive, which will lead to the fighting at Rappahannock Station and from there to the campaign at Mine Run. But where do we wind up at the end of October? Exactly where we were at the beginning of October. The Confederates are behind the Rapidan. The Federals are back into Culpeper County. The season is too late for Lee to try any more offensive action. And so the question is, will the Federals attempt to do something? And of course, as I just said, they will attempt to do something. There's going to be a Confederate disaster at Rappahannock Station, and then a thorough Yankee embarrassment at at Mine Run. What did all of that cost? It cost the Federals almost 2,300 men. It cost the Confederates 1,800. Notice that the Federals' loss is primarily missing where the Confederates are battlefield casualties. Almost all of that suffered at the Battle of Bristoe Station. So all told, in this roughly week of campaigning, 41-18 killed, wounded, missing. So roughly the same kind of casualties that you had taken at First Manassas, a little bit less. But as one Union soldier said at this point in the war, the battles are nothing now unless the dead are numbered in the thousands. Nobody's paying attention. Nobody cares because all the drama is happening out around Chattanooga. So, did Lee accomplish anything? Well, he certainly discombobulated the Army of the Potomac. He costed October. It would now only have 1 month really to do anything before 1863 was out. That matters. He redeems his army's morale a little bit. The Yankees ran from them. Stuart's cavalry did magnificently here, so it completely redeemed, and Stuart redeems himself from his Gettysburg problems during this period of the war. But he didn't really hurt the Federals that much. They're going to recover very quickly. Meade's reputation, however, takes another hit with the Federal High Command. And Secretary of the Navy Wells during this campaign is, telling Lincoln, why do you keep this man? He's a good man, and he's probably a good general, and he's certainly loyal, but he is not a great general. He's not going to win the war for you. And Lincoln says, I know, but what can I do with the generals that I have, and who among them is any better than me? And the one thing that does happen in this is that Meade's soldiers suddenly have a great deal of respect for him. They didn't really know him at Gettysburg. They believe they won that battle more than he did, and he hasn't really shown them very much since then. But Lee tried to second Manassas George Meade, and George Meade didn't let it happen. He put them through a lot of hardship, but he didn't lead them into a trap. And that's something no previous commander of the Army of the Potomac can say. So Meade rises in the estimation of his troops, even as he falls in the estimation of the high command. So that matters something too. But here's the real thing. This is often referred to as a campaign of missed opportunities. Lincoln and Halleck said, why didn't you fight at Culpeper? Why did you retreat? Why didn't you stand and fight, George Meade? And they don't care that Meade said, I didn't know where the enemy was, and that none of that matters. His reputation here. But what really happens is that the Confederates in this period have made what turned out to be the greatest mistake of the entire war. And it wasn't necessarily a mistake that was preordained, but the way things work out, it is the mistake that ultimately probably cost them their independence. When Lee and Longstreet parted, and Longstreet began his journey west, he told him, "You must beat those people out there, and then come back to me as fast as you can." And Longstreet had said, "If I live, I will, but I would not give one man in my command for a fruitless victory." And Chickamauga, for all of its tactical success, which could not have been won without Longstreet's troops, is exactly that fruitless victory. It need not have been. It could have been followed up, as Longstreet urged, and it could have potentially destroyed or wrecked the Army of the Cumberland and really reversed Confederate fortunes. But given the way things work out, the Confederates won just enough of a fight to doom their cause. Because in the same way that if Antietam had to turn out just like it did, if Lee smashed at Antietam, there's no emancipation because there's no reason for it. If Lee wins, Lincoln can't issue the Emancipation Proclamation. You needed a drawn battle that looked like a Union victory just enough that the war is going to go on to justify the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So Antietam has to turn out like a draw for the Emancipation Proclamation to happen and everything that flows from that. Chickamauga is the same thing. The Confederates have to win it to ruin Rosecrans. And ruining Rosecrans and trapping his army forces Lincoln to do something he wasn't even thinking about. And that's to call on Ulysses S. Grant. Because Grant was laid up after a buggy accident in the Mississippi. And he's thinking about going to Mobile, and Halleck is writing Meade. He says, the reason that Lee's being so aggressive in Virginia, he knows that if Banks and Grant can clear out the rebels in the Trans-Mississippi, their cause is doomed. Halleck is thinking about sending Grant to the Trans-Mississippi. And the victory at Chickamauga scrambles all of that. Now the Army of Tennessee and Grant and Sherman go to Chattanooga, and the victory at Chattanooga, which wrecks Bragg, right, elevates Grant. Because nobody was talking about making Ulysses Grant the general-in-chief until after Chattanooga. Nobody. Lincoln was worried Grant might become a political rival, would have to make sure he had no political ambition before he'd even talk about making him general-in-chief. Okay? So think about this. If Longstreet does not go west, if he stays with Lee and Lee launches an offensive against Meade in early September of 1863, we get another big battle in the East, probably doesn't, change the course of the war. Maybe the Confederates win it, redeem Gettysburg. You still have the same stalemate in Virginia, right? And Bragg fights and loses the Battle of Chickamauga. And maybe Bragg's fired, maybe he's not. But if that's the way it went, then in the spring of 1864, you have Meade going against Lee in Virginia. You have Rosecrans undertaking the movement against Atlanta, either against Bragg or Joe Johnston. And you probably have Grant and Sherman either going to Mobile or up the Red River. And we don't know how any of that would have turned out, but we can be pretty certain the war would not have gone the way in 1864 that it actually did go, right? He might have been the guy. It's kind of hard to believe that he could have gotten to Atlanta in time to save Lincoln's election, right? But maybe. Halleck was going to stay the general-in-chief. There's just... So if the Confederates had not sent Longstreet west to win the Battle of Chickamauga, there's no Chattanooga. Without Chattanooga, there's no Grant as general-in-chief. With no Grant as general-in-chief, there's no Sherman and no Thomas to push the advance on Atlanta. So one of those history things that what might have been, and the irony is the one time the Confederates in the West really win a clear-cut tactical victory, it is the one that destroys them ultimately because of the follow-on consequences from their failure to capitalize on that victory. The Confederates would have probably been far better to leave 70,000 men with Robert E. Lee in September of 1862 than to send 2 of Longstreet's corps to Georgia to fight under a guy like Braxton Bragg. So, if you think that this period of the war was boring, that nothing happened, right? That everybody's sleeping between the Wilderness and Gettysburg, guess again. And this is just one of the campaigns during this period. And my third book on this, The Battle of Rappahannock Station, represents the offensive that Meade is going to launch in early November following the Bristoe Campaign. And the book I'm working on now is the Mine Run Campaign that takes place at the very end of November and the very beginning of December of 1863 that will round out the 6 months between Gettysburg and winter quarters, the 6 months that are the bridge between what had been and what will be in the Virginia theater of the American Civil War. Thank you.